Coffee Hour. Welcome to Coffee with our morning host. We broadcast a host of programs like current topics, newspaper headlines, and music on Radio Sri Lanka. Tune in every weekday from 7 to 8 a.m.
We have a special guest here in the studio who is ready to share her expertise for the benefit of our listeners. And as usual, the interview will be hosted by Sharifa. I'll be handing over the microphone to Sharifa to continue with our interview. Over to you, Sharifa.
Thank you very much, Anupama. You're listening to Radio Sri Lanka. It's precisely 12 minutes past the hour of 7. A very good morning to you. Yes, we're with a coffee hour right now, and we're going to have a very, very serious discussion today, and it's going to be focused on the legal concerns linked with technology usage, and there's a lot to talk about it, and we have technology lawyer, attorney at law, Thanuki Goonesinghe with us this morning. A very good morning to you, Thanuki.
Good morning, Sharif. I'm happy to be here, excited about the conversation we're about to have. It is definitely my firm belief that technology is here to stay, and the discussions surrounding tech law and policy will remain pertinent and relevant for the future.
Exactly. So in a layman's point of view, if you could also tell us about the primary legal concerns linked with technology usage. And we talk a lot about artificial intelligence as well these days. So let's touch on the primary concerns linked with technology usage.
Okay. So this is going to take a bit of time, but I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible. The first legal concern that we have with AI and basically any kind of tech is this issue of the explainability of these technologies, or rather the lack thereof. I think some of our listeners may have heard of the term AI black box. What this essentially means is there's a lack of transparency about how the AI would work, and it works according to rules that are difficult to understand. So this raises a legal concern as to how does a user know what their rights are associated with a certain technology that they're using when they have no clue as to how it works in the first place. This raises a lot of concerns on a legal front, and I think our listeners will be able to understand, because you're opting to use something that you do not know about. So how do we pinpoint to where do you find redress is a question that often props up. Another important concern that comes up is about data privacy, data protection. There's this term that's being tossed around a lot, a buzzword, data scraping. Essentially, that means you're extracting data from output that is generated from another program or output that is available out there. And in terms of technology, I think the question that comes up a lot is, where is this data coming from? Are we getting the consent of the data subjects when we're taking this information? Who can access it? Under what circumstances? There's a lot of overlapping with data protection legislation as well. And this is a key concern that is then recently, just I think last September, TikTok, which is very famously used among Sri Lankans, was fined 345 million euros for failing to provide adequate protection for children's data. And this is not the only case. There are several cases across the EU, especially with regard to their general data protection regulation, pertaining to the use of data for training these AI models. Again, on data privacy, I'd just like to park a small thought with regard to neurotechnology. We use a lot of devices, smart caps, EEG machines, MRIs. There's also recently this topic of Neuralink, which is by Elon Musk's Neuralink, which basically about a week ago, this a patient who was paralyzed, the neck down, was able to play a game of chess by just thinking. But that raises an important question. What about his most private thoughts? these systems are able to record them. What about storage? Can that person make an informed decision and say, I don't want my data being stored, irrespective of the benefit I have from this system? So this is something that we need to think a lot about, because data privacy it's an intrinsic aspect for us as human beings, and the lack of it is very concerning.
And we need to spread more awareness on this as well,
of course,
as we're doing right now.
And given that we do have a Data Protection Act now, which is to come into full operation by March next year, these are things that we need to think about. How have we addressed these concerns in terms of automated processing, in terms of artificial intelligence within that act? And since we're on radio, I think important topic to talk about is disinformation, misinformation, and also deepfakes. This is a hot topic nowadays. We have a lot of deepfakes going around, hyper-realistic videos, images, voice clips, impersonating other people's likeness, voice, appearance, being spread across. And also because artificial intelligence and tech in general can be used to make something viral very quickly. Mm-hmm. This virality aspect can be achieved very much faster than ever before.
And also the need of, getting followers and being viral on social media platforms, I think, encouraged many youths to actually do this. And it's kind of considered normal. I mean, when you look at it, when you look at TikTok, as you did mention, you see a lot of these things. And little do they know that these are very concerning, isn't it?
It is. And the fact that it is freely available, this is not rocket science. This tech is quite easy to use. It's very, it's made to assist you to engage with this technology, to draw you into using this tech. And we have a lot of youth engaged in developing these. So that is something that we need to be concerned about. A very few recent examples, I'm just going to point some out for the listeners, because they need to understand how big of a problem this has become. Recently, 2 or 3 days ago, the Italian Prime Minister sued 2 individuals who are suspected of creating deepfake pornography of her. This is the Italian Prime Minister. We saw Pope Francis in a luxurious jacket, a puffy jacket, a deepfaked image of the Pope being spread around. President Biden, a video President Biden making transphobic remarks. Recent deepfakes also, Rashmika Mandana, an Indian actress. Taylor Swift, global pop sensation. It took 17 hours to take down her deepfakes, despite her being one of the most influential figures of our time. A deepfake conference call to a Hong Kong MNC employee. This conference call had a chief financial officer and other people who this employee was used to seeing and interacting with. So he made a call and he transferred millions of dollars on the basis of that conference call. Right? And also RT.com, it's a state-controlled media arm of Russia, had tweeted a deep-faked image of an explosion near the Pentagon in the US. So if you look at this, we can see, if you take risks very particularly, you can see that there are political risks, because especially given that this is a election year, 2024 is a global election year. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to think about in terms of, if you look at President Biden making transphobic statements, how would that look for him in terms of his electorates? There was also a robocall from President Biden, a deepfake robocall, which had said not to vote in the primaries. So think about, okay, how does this impact? This is disinformation. How does this impact my rights as a voter? How do I make an informed decision when I cannot be sure that the information out there is entirely true and accurate? And this is something that we need to think about even in terms of Sri Lanka. We have an election coming up later this year. And there is no doubt that we're going to have people propping up and putting out certain deepfakes of politicians that they like or dislike. on social media, and it is going to be a viral, it's definitely going for the virality factor. So it's something to think about. And if you look at things like the Italian Prime Minister, if you think of Rashmika, if you think about Taylor Swift, we're looking at, this is deepfake pornography. We're looking at reputational damage.
Not only that, it's their mental health problem as well.
Yes, very important point there, because these things contribute to a lot of psychological harm. And it doesn't matter even if you're the most powerful person out there, you're still going to be affected by it drastically. And pointing out suicidal thoughts, depression, these are very real problems that this new tech is contributing to. And also financial scams. I mean, if you think about this Hong Kong MNC, but this is not the first time. There have been other incidents in Dubai and a few other countries. So it's something that we need to really think about when we talk about this.
Exactly, and I think this topic is very vast, so we'll try our level best to maybe highlight a little bit more about what you just spoke of. And you did speak of individual data privacy rights, and how can we safeguard this in the digital age now? That's, I think, not a very easy answer for you, but still, if you could just tell us briefly about how we could do that.
So I think when we talk about safeguarding data privacy rights, that is very much a concern for companies, institutions, public or private, governments, as people who control and process data, because it is their responsibility to safeguard the data of users, consumers.
There's also cloud systems, isn't it?
Yes. So basically any businesses that handle, control, process data, institutions, public, private, governments. And this needs to be laid down very clearly in data privacy laws, regulations, guidelines. Sri Lanka has a Personal Data Protection Act, which we became amongst the first in the South Asian region to put it out there. But yes, it's very important to remember that there has to be some sort of regulation, some sort of guideline from the state's point of view in order to kind of encourage adopting this even by businesses. And then when we talk about safeguarding privacy rights, we can look at including this within organizational policies. No longer can data privacy be something that we, talk about as a side subject. It is very important that we consider data privacy to be very much a part of the DNA of the organization. And to do that, it's very important to prioritize privacy by design. Privacy by design. And I'm going to highlight a small part of the Data Protection Act of Sri Lanka, which is Article 12. It's a genius provision. It talks about having a data protection management program in companies or institutions. And taking from that, it encourages this privacy by design concept. How so? It talks about record keeping. It talks about ensuring that you design your privacy program based on the structure, scale, volume, and sensitivity of the data that you process and control within the organization, having safeguards, data protection impact assessments, integration into your governance structure, having an internal oversight mechanism, having a complaint and inquiry mechanism, periodic monitoring and assessment systems. Basically, it is encouraging this to be a living organism, the data protection management program, and something that you keep testing and keep improving, and not something that, okay, once the act comes into operation in March next year, we can forget about it. It's not something like that. It needs to be something continuous. It needs to be consistent. And also when it comes to safeguarding data privacy, we need to remember to aim for data minimization. What that means is you need to collect the minimum amount of data, personal data, that is needed to deliver a certain element of the service that you're providing. So unless it is absolutely necessary, you do not need to collect it, right? Also, safeguarding rights should include empowering users to have control over their data. That means make them part of the data privacy process as
That
an
is the people who
important...
provide data.
No, the people who are the users, the
Right,
consumers.
the consumers.
Make them a part of it. Give them a sense of control over their data. I'm not just talking about consent. I'm talking about feedback. I'm talking about making sure that they're part of that process of you putting a data privacy program together. It's very important, because how do you cater to users if you don't know what their requirements are, if you don't know what they feel about it, right? They are an important aspect, not just of your business, but also now of your data privacy program. And lastly, I think it's very important to, as companies or institutions, to prioritize privacy training, creating awareness. Even what we're doing now, we're creating awareness. This has to be something that is continuous, and it needs to be prioritized.
And with technology always growing with time, and it's always changing and evolving.
Yeah.
So I guess, as you mentioned, training sessions, it's pretty vital when it comes to companies and data privacy protection as well.
And may I just add?
Yeah.
Additionally, I think also, because I remember, like, if you're talking about safeguarding privacy rights, we need to also encourage people to not just look at it from a local point of view. We need to look at it also in the context of cross-border data flows, and people need to be encouraged, organizations, risk teams that are involved in this process need to be encouraged to look at how your local regulations are interacting with global regulations. Where are we overlapping? How do we make sure that we don't, get into problems with other countries in terms of the data that is crossing our borders into theirs and theirs into ours? Because this is not like shipping and cargo. This is something that it's a massive process. It's extremely interconnected, and I would say very quick, right? So that's something that we need to think about as well when it comes to safeguarding privacy.
Exactly. So we can also touch upon very layman points as well, because I mean, it's not just the companies or not just the hierarchy of any firms which uses technology. So you and I mean, like even people just schooling or the students, everybody uses technology. So I guess it's very vital that this awareness should be also conducted at school level as well, if I'm not mistaken. So you spoke about deep fakes and disinformation as well. So I mean, this is pretty concerning for media institutions as well, as you did mention. I mean, being on radio, I think it's very important to provide credible information to people. So now you have information everywhere. It's just a tap away. If you just use your mobile smartphone, you get anything you want. And now people sometimes come back to traditional media to find what's actually credible. So let's also talk about how we tackle the issue of disinformation and deepfakes, which are caused by artificial intelligence.
Right. So again, not to sound like a broken record, but awareness is key. We need to create awareness. We need to make sure people out there know that these things exist. Deepfakes actually exist. And we need to, through these awareness programs, we need to try our best to create a group of people or a population that is inherently diligent. A population that asks questions. What is it? Where is it coming from? Does it look accurate? Is there something funny about this? Should I be concerned? Call me paranoid, but from the time I was younger, I have never just randomly entered my details into anything, any website. I used to always ask questions, who is going to use my data? Not in those exact terms, but I used to have questions. But if you look at Sri Lanka as a culture, we're a very communal culture. We like to gossip. We like to talk about things with our neighbors. Sometimes information about family medical history is spoken of loud as ever for our neighbors to hear, or we talk over the fence about these things. This is the kind of culture we're dealing with. So trying to educate and get people to become a more privacy-oriented culture that is diligent, that asks questions, is a bit of a challenge. But I think programs like this can really help bring that about. Another way in which we can tackle disinformation deepfakes is, well, more responsibility of the big tech companies, is disclosure requirements and labeling. Well, I don't know how effective these are, because I feel like there are ways to circumvent them as well. But Google, Meta, these companies are now implementing AI labeling and disclosure requirements. Even the EU, before they recently passed their Artificial Intelligence Act, so just before that also they had basically impose a disclosure requirement on all the big tech companies to label content that is made using artificial intelligence.
Yes, because I've noticed this on, I think, news websites as well. If the article is created or written using artificial intelligence, they do mention that at the end of the article.
It has become a requirement, and I think it's important, even if it can be circumvented, still having that is important for everyday users to just get an idea of what it is that they're interacting with. Again, you have certain companies that are having restrictions on the use of manipulated data or information or anything that uses artificial intelligence, especially when it comes to election-related content. There are certain restrictions that have been put forth by certain companies, which is also very important, because especially during election times, we need to make sure that the information that you and I are getting as voters are the right thing. We have to be able to make an informed decision ultimately in order to exercise franchise in the true and the right way. If you look at it on a government perspective, I think something that we need to do is look at ways of investing in digital forensics and expertise in that area. This is something that we are lacking in Sri Lanka. I'm not necessarily an expert to talk about cybersecurity, but I know that this is something that we are lacking in comparison to other countries. Digital forensics, and this is something that we need investments in, and something that needs a lot of discussion around as well, because a key question that we have is, how do we detect a deep fake? I'm not talking about you and I just looking at an image and thinking, okay, this doesn't look right, maybe this is a deep fake. I mean, properly identifying it, right? And that requires specific tools, and these tools are not cheap. The expertise in this area is not cheap. It requires a lot of investment in that area. And if I'm not mistaken, I think there's a certain budgetary allocation towards artificial intelligence here in Sri Lanka. So I'm hoping that some of that could be directed towards tools like this, which are very important. On a personal front, I'm just looking at what you and I can do to deal with disinformation and deepfakes. We need to look for AI quirks. So basically, random blurring, things that look a little unusual, just a little off, gut feelings. Look for AI quirks. Consider the source. Don't just share anything you get. I think this was a significant problem that we had during COVID. Because suddenly everybody was on the internet, and then all the information that was coming in, everybody had to figure out what was true and what was not. So the same applies even today, not just during the time of COVID. It applies much more now, and that is to consider the source, double check, do your own research, and prevent spreading information that is not true. Within companies, you can have staff policies to say that you cannot use deepfake generating tools. You have deepfake generating tools on the internet which are freely available, that you cannot use them for content, especially, let's say, marketing companies, or anything like that. You can also have policies that prohibit individual references to persons in AI tool prompts. When you're prompting, you don't mention these people. So that will encourage the system to generate content around said reference. And also to have policies to obtain consent and licensing before using somebody's voice and likeness, if you are to use it.
I
for
think
something.
certain countries have this policy where you can't even take a public photograph if there are people behind you. You need the consent to post.
Yeah, well, sadly, Sri Lanka does not have that kind of a culture. But it's something that we need to definitely encourage, this culture of consent, but also within practical
Exactly.
considerations, because there are some situations where you cannot really get the consent of all the people in a said setting. But yeah, definitely, if we're looking at very specific individuals that we're using, let's say we're using the likeness of an artist who has passed on, okay, obtain consent of the family, obtain consent of any potentially affected parties before using their likeness and voice. This is, I think, some personal actions also that we can take to tackle disinformation.
Yes, so if we talk about simple terms and simple things which could happen and which might seem normal is getting photographs of social media platforms, getting screenshots and resharing them, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
yes.
These are things done on a regular basis, and we see that on social media platforms.
I mean, it's very scary to think that if earlier we had this problem of school kids having their pictures and their nudes being shared around, now you don't even need a nude of that person to spread an image. It can be manipulated without the presence of that nude that we're talking about. So it makes reputational damage, harm to future educational, employment prospects. All these things come along with, things like this. It makes it much, much easier to do all of that. Now, I'm not disregarding the benefits of artificial intelligence or technology. It really does help. But there's no point in talking about the good sides. We need to look at the downsides. We need to prepare for the worst or what is to come. And I hope this helps.
Exactly. So we're going to go in for a short break and we'll be back.
Mosquitoes are dangerous. It's time to protect yourself from mosquitoes. Siddhalepa Mossaway. Spray directly onto your skin or clothes. Not harmful to your skin at all. Available at all outlets. Try Siddhalepa Natural Mossaway.
Radio wherever you are. Radio Sri Lanka. Radio Sri Lanka, the station to the nation.
You're listening to Radio Sri Lanka, and yes, we're talking about something really important and something we use on a regular basis, and how we could protect ourselves and also spread awareness at the same time in terms of the legal framework which has been put forward in terms of protecting your data, your privacy, and also about how this could affect mental health as well, because it's very important to lead a happy life, isn't it? At the end of the day, that's what we're looking at. So we are in conversation with technology lawyer Thanuki Goonesinghe, and we spoke about disinformation and also about misinformation and how people could manipulate things as well. This seems very normal. This seems like it's okay to do it, and it's okay to download an image because Facebook lets you download the image. But it is really concerning when you think about how people could just manipulate somebody's personal photographs. So let's also talk about the legal frameworks and guidelines which are available at present to ensure the ethical and secure development and deployment of AI, because you mentioned that there's a good side and the bad side, and we're talking about what could be the worst in terms of technology, but everything comes with ups and downs, isn't it? Let's touch on that as well.
Yeah. So if we talk about legal ethical frameworks, I've seen that there's quite a bit of guidelines that are being put out there by different governments. But I think the recent European Union Artificial Intelligence Act needs to be talked about a little bit. It's a very long, comprehensive piece of legislation. But there are many points that we can look at from the Act and take some inspiration from there. So it talks about, it includes a classification according to risk. So basically there's unacceptable risk, which talks about social scoring systems, manipulative AI tools come under this classification. And there are some high risk systems, limited risk like chatbots and deepfake generation. Well, that is, in my opinion, questionable, because I don't know if deepfakes can be considered limited risk per se, especially if they have an impact on state. Like, for example, if we're talking about things that a president of a country says which are not true, it could have a detrimental impact not just on the state but also international relations. So then I don't know if you can say that that is a limited risk, that, well, it's categorized accordingly. And there's also minimum risk like AI in video games. And here I would say, considerations of things like the metaverse also comes into play. And then it calls the question, can you say that the metaverse in itself is of a minimal risk? Because a few months ago in UK, the police started an investigation into a case where a 16-year-old female complained of being gang raped, groped on a metaverse platform, right? So remember, this is not physical. This is entirely mental. It's psychological, and it has all those sensations, because when you are in a metaverse gaming platform, you will use augmented reality, virtual reality, spatial reality devices. You will use gloves and all these other things that will make you feel like you are in that sequence.
You're mentally there.
You're feeling all of it, the vibrations, if you're being shoved around, if it's a shooting game, you will feel all of those, the impacts of that. And within such a setup, this 16-year-old complained of being groped by a gang of people. And this is being investigated into by the UK police. So then again, that calls the question, okay, can these be considered minimal risk? Because anything has a full spectrum that we need to consider. Then also under the EU AI Act, major obligations fall on the developers of high-risk AI systems. That is, whether they are in the EU or elsewhere. So that is something we need to keep in mind, because we may be elsewhere, but if we are providing a service to somebody in the EU, then, and if we are a developer, then we too become relevant to them in terms of regulation. It defines users, it defines general purpose AI, and it talks about how you need to provide technical documentation, instructions for use pertaining to said tool. It needs to provide consistent summaries of the AI training, how it is done, where does that data come from. It requires conducting model evaluations, having adversarial testing, tracking, reporting incidents, and also having cybersecurity protections. So these are the things that are covered under the EU AI Act. But last Thursday, the 21st of March, the United Nations unanimously passed a resolution on artificial intelligence, which it titled Seizing Opportunities for Safe, Secure and Trustworthy AI for Sustainable Development. So if we look at sustainable development, we know that there are sustainable development goals, which we have until 2030 to try and achieve. It has a great respect for human rights. So the UN resolution really focuses on that, and it advances a shared vision for principles like having human-centric artificial intelligence, reliability, explainability, ethical, inclusive, privacy-preserving, and responsible governance of AI. And this is similar to the UNESCO recommendations on AI ethics of 2021, but this specifically, because it was unanimously passed, it attempts to reach all countries and bridge the digital divide as well when it comes to accessibility to these technologies. I mean, there are quite a few guidelines on AI. Even China recently released some guidelines on use of artificial intelligence and with regard to intellectual property rights. That's something that has become a very big conversation.
Exactly.
Lots of authors like John Grisham, Franzen, they have sued OpenAI, Microsoft for apparently training those AI models using the content in their books without any compensation for them. And these are significant issues. And so there are certain guidelines on those aspects as well. I mean, if I'm to talk about guidelines, we can go on till tomorrow, but I decided specifically to talk about the two most recent kind of guidelines that have come up, or frameworks that have come up, because the EU is considered a standard setter when it comes to AI and technology and regulations in that area. And of course the UN, because it has global impact, and that's something we need to consider.
Exactly. And I'm just going to make this a bit quick because I need to focus on, I think, a lot more as well, since we are on the topic of something which we use on a regular basis. And this is a program where we could spread a lot of awareness to the general public out there. So let's also touch upon the algorithms as well, because AI also follows algorithms and also studies you and how you use an app, or how you use your smartphone, if you could put it that way. So how can bias and discrimination issues in AI algorithms be mitigated?
Yes. So I think the first question you need to ask there is, how does bias and discriminatory aspects creep into an artificial intelligence model or the algorithm? Is mainly because of the training data. And if it is fed training data which has inherent biases in it, historical, societal inequities, then that will eventually at some point get reflected in the outputs generated by the AI model. And how we address that is very simply, we will need to basically encourage people to stay up to date, and including management of these companies that are involved in the development of these tools, and change the culture of bias and discrimination. It can't be something that you just change a bit of the training data and then eventually the output will change. It's not something like that. It needs to be systemic change. If society is changing and more accepting of situations where this bias, this discrimination, whether it's gender-based or racial or anything else, if society is changing, eventually that will creep into the models that we are training. So we need to encourage that organic change, I would think, and that's very important.
It's a long shot, I'd say.
It is very, I think most of the things that we talk about here are long-term things. These are not things that are going to change overnight.
Exactly.
But we need to start somewhere. That gradual evolution needs to start with 1, 2, 3, 4 people talking about it in different parts of the world, and then that having a ripple effect. Also, creating conversations aimed at cultural change, while also having a human in the loop. This human in the loop is a very commonly used concept when it comes to development of AI models, because you need to have a human to have that touch, basically, to double check and to make sure things are all right. And that's very important, I think, even in everyday life, not just when it comes to AI, having a bit of that human flavor and not just depending on technology entirely. invest in diversifying the AI field in itself. What I mean to say is like engineers, developers, designers, lawyers, the entire group of people that are working on a certain system, we need to try and diversify them. Have more women, have LGBTQIA people, have people representing different racial groups, especially minorities. Have that representation within the field in itself. And since you mentioned education before, I think it's very important that we look at including, I don't know whether we want to be teaching AI to schools, but rather I would think having a proper ethics aspect included throughout your school curriculum. So that when you actually leave school, and this should also be there in university education, when you leave school, you're leaving with that mindset already to combat these biases and discrimination that is already very much part of our society.
Yes, I think it's about cultivating this into the mindset, and as you mentioned that it has to have like an overall change to actually get the algorithm and biases mitigated in AI itself. So let's also talk about who bears liability for damages caused by AI systems.
Okay. So here, when we talk about liability for damage, the easiest example to point to is autonomous vehicles, the self-driving cars, and in an event where you meet with an accident with a self-driving vehicle without a driver in it, then who bears responsibility? This is a common question that comes up. In the EU, there was a report a few years ago which talks about safety liability implications of AI, Internet of Things, which is basically a global system of interconnected devices that can communicate with each other and exchange data, and robotics. So there was a report. It's a comprehensive report. And this report talks about this concept in law which we call strict liability. Strict liability is where basically we are attributing liability without looking for an element of fault, okay, for the party accused of the offense. So basically, if you are in control of the system, then you are liable. For example, in let's say the vehicle is a Tesla, let's say you're the manufacturer, you are liable even if the problem happened after the product was released into the market. Okay, you're being held liable. But there are also discussions now about whether or not AI should have a separate legal personality. What I mean by that is whether you would consider it as a separate person before a court of law. Now, in Sri Lanka, under the Companies Act, we consider companies, private limited companies are considered, basically if you're registered under the Companies Act, you are considered a separate person before court of law. You're separate from the people that comprise that organization. Similarly, there is conversation now to consider whether an AI can be considered a separate person in that same fashion. And I think that is something we need to consider, because at the level or the speed at which AI is developing, sooner or later we're going to have AI that is able to think on its own without us having to prompt this AI continuously. Right? Exactly. And it's not about waiting till that happens to try and figure out what the law is. We need to be proactive, and by we, I don't mean myself or any of us here, but if you look at global regulation front, that needs to be something that they need to prioritize and think about. It's either that or we follow the sayings of people like Elon Musk, who has said we need to stop the further development of AI for some time because it's scary. Because it's scary as to the rate at which AI is developing. So yeah.
So we've come to the final few minutes of the show, so I'm going to talk about Sri Lanka. So how ready is Sri Lanka to deal with the impacts of new technology? Thanuki.
Okay. So if I were to claim that Sri Lanka is thriving in tech law in the tech law and policy front, I would be far from the truth. Because yes, we do have we have quite a few laws and regulations dealing with different aspects of technology. But I think the recent example of the Online Safety Act, which was quite rushed, and there's quite a bit of negative commentary on the act. I mean, it's all over the news. It's a recent example of why we need to think long and hard about this, as to where we're heading and how prepared are we to answer the questions that are coming our way. The reality is that we have a long way to go, and addressing the challenges demands a very innovative and expansive interpretation of the laws. And what I mean to say is we have to try to align our existing legal framework with the evolving tech landscape. I don't think it is wise at all to try and create a new law for every emerging new technology, if you understand what I mean. We need to try and see where it fits. For example, there's blockchain. Blockchain is like a taboo subject in this country for some very sad reason, because there are many benefits of blockchain. And maybe we can talk about it another time. But blockchain is essentially fintech. What I mean by aligning it or expansive interpretation is, where does blockchain fit? Would it fit in some law that talks about electronic transactions, like the Electronic Transactions Act? Can it fit into an e-commerce regulation instead of having a separate Sri Lankan Blockchain Regulation Act? You know what I mean? Same with AI. We have the Personal Data Protection Law. We have the OSA. Amend these acts, add guidelines.
To be flexible.
To future-proof the laws. That is what I encourage all the time. Because if we try to cater new laws to every single problem that props up, we're going to have a whole gamut of laws and no one will know what to use, and there'll be a lot of overlaps, and we will not be able to really come to a solution because we have to tick all the boxes. We're just inherently complicating it for ourselves. Whereas if we align the existing laws, it will be much easier. The law is supposed to help us, not confuse us or cause us more trouble. So that's something that I would like to leave out there.
Exactly, and I think we've almost reached 8, but just a final message to the youth out there who's all the time on their phone, on their smartphone. What would be the most simple advice you'd like to give them?
Okay. So I'm going to just quickly give a quote from Albert Einstein, right? He said, "Imagination is more important than knowledge. For knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution." We don't know what the future holds, but we can train our minds to imagine the possibilities and prepare for it as best as we can. We are humans after all, right? We can't expect extraordinary things overnight, but we can prepare ourselves for it. The same applies for the laws, the policies, and same applies in the broader context of life. When you're interacting with technology, imagine not just the good, but the worst. Prepare for the worst, is what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Thanuki. This was very insightful, and would love to have you on board again.
Thank you very much for having me.
And with that, it's time for us to conclude Coffee Hour, and it's back to Anupama to give you some good company.